My sister ordered me to skip my master's graduation and babysit her kids, then called me an attention seeker for wanting my hats and gowns moment, so I gave her a nightmare vacation. My phone rang 2 weeks before graduation. Renata's voice came through bright and fake sweet, the tone she used right before she asked for something. I booked Hawaii for our anniversary, she said. You're watching the kids. I laughed. I actually laughed out loud, standing in my kitchen with a spoon in one hand, because the timing was so absurd it had to be a joke. She wasn't joking. Renata, that's my graduation. My master's. 6 years of night school. You can walk in December, she said, like December was a coupon that hadn't expired yet. This is a once-a-year trip. Non-refundable tickets, Corinne. Your degree will just have to wait. I told her 50 people were coming. I told her our grandfather was flying in from Scottsdale just to watch me cross that stage, that he'd already booked the flight, that he was 78 years old and this mattered to him. It's a piece of paper, Renata snapped. You're being an attention seeker over hats and gowns. Real adults don't need people clapping for them. You don't understand, Renata pressed, her voice climbing half an octave, the way it always did right before she decided a conversation was over whether I agreed or not. Owen already booked the excursions. I already told his parents we'd be there for the anniversary dinner. You're going to make me look like a liar in front of his entire family over some ceremony you can literally attend in 6 months. It's not the same ceremony, I said. There isn't a makeup date, Renata. It's May 17th or it's nothing. Then it's nothing, she said, and hung up first, the way she always did, the way she'd been doing since we were teenagers, ending conversations at the exact moment they stopped going her way. I hung up shaking. My hand actually trembled around the phone. This wasn't new. She had wrecked my GRE date 4 years earlier with a fake medical emergency. She had brought 2 sick kids to my bachelor's ceremony, and I spent the entire thing in a bathroom stall holding a toddler while my name got called to an empty aisle. Not this time, I told myself. Not again. Then I called her back and said yes. I told her I would watch the kids. Renata practically sang with relief. See? This is why you're my favorite person, she said, like she hadn't just called me pathetic 90 seconds earlier. I didn't tell her what I was actually planning. I didn't tell anyone yet. I just said okay, and hung up and sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop open to the graduation venue's parking map, already working out logistics that had nothing to do with babysitting. The morning of her flight, Renata dropped Milo, Ren, and Bo at my apartment at 7 a.m. for a 9 o'clock departure. She was wearing a sundress and sunglasses pushed up into her hair, already vacationing before she'd left the state. They've had breakfast, she said, handing me 3 backpacks and a diaper bag. Bo might need a nap around 11. Emergency cards in the front pocket if anything comes up. Love you, thank you so much, you're a lifesaver. She kissed the top of Milo's head, waved at Ren, and didn't look back at Bo at all. Her car turned the corner toward the highway 3 minutes later. I stood in my doorway with 3 children and a diaper bag and felt something in my chest go very still and very clear. We're going to a very important party, I told them, crouching down to Ren's eye level. You have to wear your nicest clothes. Can you help me pick something out, Ren? Ren, who was 6 and took every assignment seriously, nodded like I'd handed her a mission. By 8:30, all 3 kids were dressed. Milo in a collared shirt he hated, Ren in a yellow dress with a bow she picked herself, Bo in a onesie with a tiny clip-on tie I'd bought on a whim months earlier and never had a reason to use. I packed snacks, a portable phone charger, and the handmade signs I'd finished at midnight, block letters on poster board that read, "Our aunt is amazing," in 3 different colors of marker. I need to explain something before I go further, because none of what happened next makes sense without it. I was 29 years old. I had spent 6 years getting a master's degree in forensic accounting while working full-time at Hallbrook & Wexler, a mid-sized CPA firm in Dayton that specialized in fraud audits for regional banks. I took 2 night classes a semester for 6 years because I couldn't afford to quit my job, and because my father left when I was 8, and because there had never once in my adult life been a moment where someone else's needs didn't come before mine by default. Our mother, Deborah, worked billing at Grant Medical Center for 11 years after the divorce, most of it double shifts, 7 to 7, 4 days a week, because a single income raising 2 daughters in a 2-bedroom rental on Fenwick Street didn't stretch nearly as far as anyone pretended it did. I remember eating cereal for dinner more nights than I'd like to admit, and I remember Renata rationing it out into 2 bowls with the exact same care she'd later apply to rationing out affection, measured, deliberate, never quite generous enough to feel abundant. Deborah remarried in 2011 to a quiet contractor named Hank, who was kind to both of us in an undemonstrative way, and the double shifts eventually stopped, but by then the shape of our family had already set, the way concrete sets whether or not you meant to leave a handprint in it. Renata is 3 years older than me. When our father walked out in 2004, taking a duffel bag and the good car, and leaving a note on the kitchen counter that our mother kept in a drawer for a decade, Renata was 11. She became, in the language our family still uses without irony, the responsible one. She packed my lunches, she walked me to the bus stop. She told our mother, who worked double shifts at a hospital billing office, that she had everything handled, and for the most part she did. I loved her for it. I still do, somewhere underneath everything that came after. But somewhere between being 11 and being 32, Renata's caretaking curdled into something else. It became a ledger. Every sacrifice she made for me as a child turned into a debt she expected me to keep paying as an adult, with interest, indefinitely, no statute of limitations. She married Owen Callahan in 2017. He's a mechanical engineer engineer at an aerospace supplier outside Dayton, quiet, steady, the kind of man who remembers everyone's birthday and apologizes first even when he isn't wrong. They had Milo in 2016, Ren in 2019, and Bo in 2021. Renata stopped working after Milo was born and never went back, which was her choice and her right. But it also meant that free childcare became, in her mind, a family resource she was entitled to draw on whenever it suited her. The pattern started small, a last-minute request to watch Milo for just an hour that became 4, a canceled coffee date because she needed me to pick Ren up from preschool. I said yes almost every time because I loved those kids, because I loved my sister, because saying no felt like betraying the 11-year-old who used to braid my hair before school. Then, in October of 2021, I had a scheduled GRE test date. I had studied for 4 months. I had paid $205 for the registration, money that mattered a great deal to a 25-year-old accountant with student loans. Renata called me at 6 in the morning, crying, saying she was doubled over in pain and needed someone to take her to urgent care because Owen was traveling for work in Chicago. I canceled my test. I drove her to the emergency room. I sat with her for 6 hours while doctors ran tests that came back completely normal. She was diagnosed with gas. She never apologized. When I mentioned, gently, a week later, that I'd lost my test fee and had to push my program application back an entire year, she told me I was being dramatic, that family comes before some standardized test, that she would have done the same for me. I believed her. That was the thing about Renata. She said things with such total conviction that you started to doubt your own memory of what had actually happened. The second incident I want to tell you about happened in May of 2019, at my bachelor's degree ceremony at Kestrel Ridge State University. Ren was 3 months old and Milo was 3 years old, and Renata brought both of them despite the fact that Milo had been sent home from daycare 2 days earlier with a stomach bug that turned out to be norovirus. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't want to miss the ceremony, and she didn't want to admit she needed a babysitter of her own to attend it, so she just brought 2 contagious children into a crowded auditorium. Milo threw up on my mother's shoes during the opening remarks. Renata, mortified and furious in equal measure, thrust Ren into my arms in the lobby, said she needed to handle this, and disappeared for 40 minutes to clean up her son. I was already in my cap and gown, already lined up to process, and now I was holding a 3-month-old in a bathroom stall because there was nowhere else to put her. They called my name 11 minutes later. I heard it through the bathroom door, my own name, echoing across an auditorium of 500 people, followed by silence, followed by the next name. I never walked across that stage. I have a diploma that arrived in the mail 3 weeks later in a cardboard tube. When I brought it up afterward, gently, the way you bring up something that still stings 2 years later, Renata told me I was being selfish for even mentioning it, that she'd had a genuine crisis with her son's health, that some people would understand family emergencies come first. And did I really want to make this about myself? I want to be honest with you about something. Part of me believed I deserved that. Part of me had absorbed somewhere in childhood the idea that my needs were negotiable, and Renata's were not. That belief took root so early I didn't even recognize it as a belief. It just felt like the truth. I want to be fair to what we had though, because it wasn't only debt and obligation. There were real years in between. Good ones. Years I still reach for on hard days. When I was 17 and failed my driver's test twice, Renata was the one who took me out every Sunday morning for a month in an empty church parking lot, patient in a way she rarely managed with anyone else, until I finally parallel parked well enough to pass. When I moved into my first apartment at 22, she showed up with a toolbox she barely knew how to use and assembled a bookshelf with me over an entire Saturday, both of us laughing at the instructions until nearly midnight. She used to call me on my birthday before anyone else in the family, every single year, first thing in the morning, just to say she was glad I existed. I don't think she was lying in those moments. I think she meant them completely. That's what made everything afterwards so hard to name for so long. Cruelty is easy to spot. It's much harder to see clearly when it's wrapped inside a person who has also, genuinely, loved you. That's the family history that was sitting underneath my kitchen table on the morning I dressed 3 children in their best clothes and told them we were going to a very important party. The 2 weeks between that first phone call and the morning she dropped the kids off did not pass quietly. Renata never asks for something once. She tests the edges of it over and over to see how far the frame will stretch before it breaks. The first crack came 2 days after the initial call. She rang me at work in the middle of a client meeting, and I stepped into the hallway to take it because some old instinct in me still treated her calls as emergencies by default. I need you to also grab Milo from baseball practice Tuesday and Wednesday, she said. And can you keep them through Monday instead of Sunday? Our flight back got pushed. I agreed. I told myself it was reasonable, that 4 extra days wasn't so different from 3, that I was already committed. I didn't clock at the time that the scope of the favor had just grown by nearly 40% in a single phone call, with no discussion, no apology, no acknowledgement that this was more than what I'd originally said yes to. The second crack came from an unexpected direction. My grandfather called me on a Thursday evening, sounding puzzled. Renata phoned me today, Elias said, his voice carrying that particular Arizona dryness that meant he was choosing his words carefully. She said I shouldn't bother flying out for your ceremony, said these things run long and boring, and I'd be better off saving the trip for something bigger down the line. I stood very still in my kitchen. She said that? She did. Told her I already bought the ticket. A pause. "You still want your old man there, don't you?" I told him yes, of course, more than anything, and hung up shaking for the second time in 2 weeks. I understood even then what Renata was actually doing. She wasn't trying to spare our grandfather a boring afternoon. She was trying to shrink the audience. Fewer witnesses meant fewer people who might notice her 3 children sitting in an empty house on the day of my graduation while she posted vacation photos from a resort in Maui. I didn't confront her about it. I filed it away instead, the way I file away discrepancies in a set of financial records that don't add up yet but will eventually. The third crack came 4 days before her flight. She called again, and this time her voice had shifted into a register I recognized from childhood, the one that meant she needed something and had decided crying was the fastest way to get it. "Owen and I haven't been okay," she said. "This trip is the only thing holding us together right now. If I cancel it, I genuinely don't know what happens to my marriage. Do you understand what you'd be doing to this family if you backed out now?" I hadn't said a single word about backing out. I had already agreed, but Renata wasn't actually talking to me about the trip anymore. She was preloading a narrative, building a case file she could use later if I ever did try to say no to anything, a case file that would let her say she'd warned me, that she'd told me what was at stake, that any failure on my part would be the reason her marriage fell apart. "I said I'd watch them, Renata," I told her. "I'm not backing out. I know. I just need you to understand how much this matters." Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "Mom agrees with me, by the way. She thinks you're being a little precious about the timing of all this." I hadn't spoken to our mother about any of it. I found out 3 days later that Renata had called her too, framing the entire situation as me graciously offering to babysit. No mention of graduation at all. No mention of the fact that she was asking me to skip my own ceremony. Our mother had agreed, in the abstract, that family helps family, without knowing what she was actually agreeing to. The fourth crack came the following afternoon, and it was the one that unsettled me most, because it didn't come from Renata directly at all. My phone buzzed with a video call from Ren's tablet, and when I answered, my 6-year-old niece was sitting cross-legged on her bedroom floor, clearly coached, reciting a sentence that didn't sound like anything a 6-year-old would generate on her own. "Mommy says if you don't want to babysit us, you can just say so," Ren said, reading the cadence of it like a line memorized rather than felt. "She says we're not that much trouble." I heard Renata's voice in the background, muffled, prompting something else, and Ren glanced off screen before the call cut out entirely. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long moment, understanding exactly what had just happened. Renata had run out of angles to work on me directly, so she'd started working through her own daughter instead, turning a 6-year-old into a small, unwitting messenger for an argument she didn't have the standing to make herself anymore. I didn't call back to address it. I simply made a note, the same way I noted everything else that spring, filed under evidence I hoped I would never actually need. The fifth crack, the one that mattered most, came the night before she left. Renata showed up at my apartment unannounced to drop off a car seat and, in her words, go over the rules. She stood in my kitchen with her arms crossed and delivered a set of instructions like she was briefing a subordinate. "Milo needs his inhaler if he starts wheezing. It's in the front pocket of his backpack. Ren will lie about brushing her teeth, don't believe her. Bo still isn't sleeping through the night, so don't expect much rest." Then she set a credit card down on my counter, a supplemental Chase Sapphire card with her name embossed above mine, ending in 4471. "This is for real emergencies only," she said, tapping it twice with one finger. "Not takeout, not a treat. A real emergency involving one of my kids. I will check the statement the second I land, Corinne. And if you use this for anything else, I will never let you forget it." I remember that moment with unusual clarity, the way you remember the exact wording of something before you understand why it's going to matter later. She texted me the same rules that night, in writing, time-stamped 9:47 p.m. "This card is for genuine emergencies involving Milo, Ren, or Bo only. Nothing else. I'm trusting you." I saved that text. I didn't know yet that I would need it. I just had the accountant's instinct to keep records, the same instinct that had gotten me through 6 years of night classes in a field built entirely on the principle that paper trails don't lie even when people do. The sixth and final crack came the morning of the flight itself, standing in my doorway with 3 backpacks and a diaper bag between us. "You're a lifesaver," Renata said, and then, lowering her voice so the kids wouldn't hear, "And don't you dare make this weird by bringing up the graduation thing to Mom or Grandpa. I don't need everyone treating me like the villain over a scheduling conflict." I said nothing. I just took Bo's diaper bag off her shoulder and watched her walk to her car, sunglasses already pushed up into her hair, already halfway to paradise in her own mind. Her car turned the corner 3 minutes later. I stood in my doorway with 3 children and felt something in my chest go very still and very clear. The exact same feeling I'd have described earlier if I hadn't already told you about it, because it's worth repeating. I wasn't angry in that moment. I was calm in a way that frightened me a little. The calm of someone who has finally stopped negotiating with a fire and started building a fireproof room instead. "We're going to a very important party," I told the kids again. And this time, I meant every word of it. By 8:30, all 3 of them were dressed in the outfits Ren had helped me pick. The poster board signs drying on my kitchen table. Block letters that read, "Our aunt is amazing," in 3 colors of marker. I packed snacks, a phone charger, and Bo's clip-on tie, and we drove to Kestrel Ridge State University with the windows down and Milo narrating the entire trip like a sports announcer. I sat them front row, dead center, in seats I'd reserved weeks earlier for family who now wouldn't be filling them. My grandfather found us 20 minutes before before the ceremony started, wearing a bolo tie he'd bought specifically for the occasion, and when he saw the 3 kids holding their signs, something in his face shifted, some calculation clicking quietly into place behind his eyes. "Where's Renata?" he asked, already knowing. "Hawaii," I said. "Anniversary trip." He looked at the kids, then at me, then said nothing further about it, which somehow told me more than any speech could have. The ceremony began. 500 names, a program a half-inch thick, the particular hush of an auditorium waiting for something. When they called mine, I heard 3 small voices before I heard anything else, screaming louder than the entire row behind them. "That's our aunt! That's our aunt!" The dean, a woman named Patricia Osei, who had clearly given this speech 100 times before, actually stopped the procession for a moment, laughing into the microphone, and told the crowd that whoever had brought their own personal fan club deserved a second round of applause. 500 people laughed and clapped again. My grandfather stood up on his own, cane and all, applauding until his hands must have hurt. Dean Osei found me afterward near the stage steps, still in her regalia, and told me, without any prompting, that in 11 years of handing out diplomas she couldn't remember a louder ovation for a single name. "Whoever those kids belong to," she said, "they clearly think you hung the moon." I told her they were my sisters, and left it at that, and something in her face suggested she understood exactly the shape of the sentence I hadn't said. Afterward, in the lobby, Elias declared all 3 kids honorary graduates on the spot, pulling candy diplomas out of his jacket pocket that he'd apparently had made weeks in advance, rolled in ribbon, one for each of them. Bo ate half of his before anyone could stop him. Then quietly, standing near the coat check with Bo on my hip, I opened the banking app on my phone, found the reservation Renata had made under the household account we still shared from years earlier when I'd co-signed her first credit card as a favor, and I canceled her hotel reservation using the emergency card she'd handed me that morning. I want to be precise about my reasoning, because I've thought about it many times since. 3 children cheering for their aunt at her graduation, in an auditorium she nearly missed entirely, after being told her degree was a piece of paper not worth clapping for, counted as an emergency. In my book, it was the truest thing that card had been used for in its entire existence. Renata and Owen landed in Maui 4 hours later to discover their room had been given away, forced to pay nearly triple the original rate for a last-minute replacement suite. My phone started buzzing before I'd even left the parking lot. The first voicemail was disbelief. The second was fury. By the fourth, her voice had dropped into something colder, more controlled, more frightening in its stillness than any of the shouting had been. "I'll deal with you when I get back," the 6th voicemail said, flat and quiet. "Watch yourself. I saved every single one of them." Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. I turned my phone face down on the passenger seat and drove 3 children to a diner instead, where Milo ordered pancakes shaped like his own name, and Ren told our waitress, unprompted, that her aunt had just become a doctor, which was not remotely true, but which nobody bothered to correct. The next morning, the family group chat had 43 unread messages waiting when I finally turned my phone back on. Renata had posted at midnight her time, 6 a.m., mine, a wall of text claiming I had happily agreed to babysit and then sabotaged her marriage out of pure jealousy over her having a family, while I, in her words, chose a career over a life. My Aunt Rosalind, my father's sister, wrote 3 separate paragraphs defending her, the way she always had ever since we were children, and Rosalind decided Renata was the responsible Voss sister, and I was the difficult one. My mother texted asking me to call immediately, and something in the phrasing made my stomach drop, because my mother doesn't usually type in full sentences when she's just annoyed. She types in full sentences when she's scared. I didn't call. Not yet. Instead, I opened my photos and started forwarding evidence into the chat. One message at a time, methodical, the way I'd been trained to lay out a fraud case for a bank client who didn't want to believe their own bookkeeper had been stealing from them for 3 years. You don't argue with people like that. You show them the numbers and let the numbers do the arguing. I posted the text from 2 weeks earlier. You can walk in December, your degree will just have to wait. I posted the one that came after. You're being an attention seeker over hats and gowns. Real adults don't need people clapping for them. I posted the 9:47 p.m. text about the emergency card, the one where she'd written the words, "I'm trusting you," in a message she now claimed had never included those terms at all. I posted a photo of the 3 kids in the front row holding their signs, time-stamped, geotagged, undeniable. The chat went quiet. 15 people had read it within 4 minutes. Nobody typed a single word for almost an hour. Then my grandfather, who had never once posted in that group chat in the 4 years it had existed, who I'm honestly not sure knew how to attach a photo to a text message, wrote 5 words that ended the conversation entirely. "We can all read, Renata." Nobody replied after that. Nobody needed to. My cousin Marlon messaged me privately within the hour, saying he'd been waiting years for someone to finally say something, and then telling me, for the first time, about his own engagement party 2 years earlier, the one Renata had hijacked with a manufactured emergency call about Ren having a fever, pulling half the room's attention away from Marlon and his fiancée for 45 minutes over what turned out to be nothing. My Uncle Foster wrote next, describing almost the exact same pattern at his daughter's piano recital the previous spring, down to the phrase, "real family emergency," which he said Renata had used verbatim. My best friend Nova Renata, who has known me since we were 19 and living in the same dorm hallway, showed up at my apartment 2 hours later with a bag of takeout and declared herself my hero for the day, on my behalf, since I clearly wasn't going to declare it for myself. She sat cross-legged on my kitchen floor while Bo napped in the next room, scrolling through the group chat screenshots with the particular outrage only a lifelong friend can supply on demand. You know what the actual craziest part is, Nova said, not looking up from her phone. She handed you a card with rules in writing. In writing, Corinne, she built the trap herself and then acted shocked when you knew exactly where the door was. She looked up at me then, softer. How are you actually doing, though? Not the headline version, the real one. I told her the truth, that I felt strangely calm, calmer than the situation probably warranted, and that the calm scared me a little more than the anger would have. Nova just nodded, like that made perfect sense to her, and didn't try to talk me out of feeling it. My Aunt Rosalind called next, and her fury had not cooled at all in the time it took the group chat to fall silent around her. She demanded I repay every cent of the hotel charges immediately, called what I'd done outright theft, said I had no right to touch a card that wasn't mine. I reminded her calmly that Renata had handed me that card in writing for emergencies involving her own children, and that 3 children cheering their aunt on at her own graduation, after being told that graduation didn't matter, qualified as an emergency in my professional opinion, an opinion I happened to be paid quite well to hold for a living. Rosalind sputtered something about semantics, and I let the silence sit there until she hung up first. By early afternoon, my phone rang with a number I recognized instantly. Owen. His voice was shaking before he'd even finished saying my name. He asked very carefully whether the kids had actually enjoyed themselves at the ceremony, whether any of what Renata had described in her version of events was even remotely true. I didn't answer him with words. I sent him the photos instead, the 3 of them front row with their signs. Bo's candy diploma, Milo's collared shirt he'd complained about all morning but wore anyway, Ren's yellow dress with the bow she'd picked herself. He went quiet on the other end of the line for a long time. Then I heard him, 3,000 miles away in a hotel room in Maui, start to cry. The particular kind of crying men do when they're trying very hard not to, and failing anyway. She told me you volunteered, he said, his voice cracking around the words. She told me it was your idea. She said you offered, that it was your gift to us, that you wanted the practice before you had kids of your own someday. I would never have gotten on that plane if I'd known what she actually asked of you. I sat down slowly on my balcony, phone pressed hard against my ear, listening to my sister's husband fall apart on the other side of an ocean, and I felt the ground tilt underneath me in a way that had nothing to do with the graduation or the hotel reservation at all. Because if Renata had lied to Owen about something this specific, this easy to disprove, this small in the grand architecture of a marriage, what else had she reshaped into something more convenient over the last 8 years? There's something else, Owen said, quieter now, like he was working up to it. Renata's mother called me a few months ago. She mentioned something about checks from your grandfather for your tuition. I went very still. My grandfather had been helping me with school since 2023, $500 a month, wired directly into my account after the first year. But before that, in the beginning, he'd mailed physical checks to our childhood address in Columbus. The address Renata still checked twice a week because our mother had moved but never updated her mail forwarding, and Renata still had a key. I had assumed for over a year that 4 of those checks had simply gotten lost in the mail. I'd never questioned it out loud, because questioning things out loud in my family had a cost I usually wasn't willing to pay, and because my grandfather, embarrassed about the loss, had simply started wiring the money instead, and neither of us mentioned the missing checks again. I remembered specifically asking him about it once, in March of 2023, over the phone. He'd apologized, said the post office out of Scottsdale had been unreliable that winter, that he'd read about a mail theft ring operating out of a sorting facility 2 counties over, and figured that explained it. I'd believed him completely, because it was a perfectly reasonable explanation, because mail theft rings are a real thing that happens to real people, and because it had genuinely never once occurred to me that the person most likely to have taken something meant for me would be my own sister, standing in our childhood kitchen with a key she'd never given back. She told her mother she was holding on to them to keep them safe, Owen said. Something about not wanting Deborah to feel bad that Elias was helping you and not her kids too. I didn't think much of it at the time. I'm sorry, Corinne. I should have said something months ago. I didn't say anything for a long moment. I was doing math in my head, the kind of math I do for a living. 4 checks at $500 each, $2,000 that had simply evaporated somewhere between my grandfather's mailbox in Scottsdale and mine in Dayton, deposited, I now understood with total clarity, into an account that was not mine. I hung up with Owen and sat there a long time on my balcony, watching the light change over the parking lot, feeling less like a wronged sister and more like an auditor who had just found the first real discrepancy in a set of books that had looked clean for years. That's the thing about fraud, professionally speaking. It's never one entry. Once you find the first one, you go looking for the rest, and you almost always find them. I opened my banking app again, this time my own, and started pulling old statements from 2022, looking for the exact dates my grandfather had told me he'd mailed those checks, cross-referencing them against nothing, because of course there was nothing on my end to cross-reference. The money had never reached me at all. It had reached someone else's account, an account I now suspected I could identify with a single phone call. My phone buzzed again before I could make that call. A new number, no name attached, a Hawaii area code I didn't didn't recognize. Just one line waiting on the screen, glowing in the dim light of my apartment as the sun went down outside. She's on the next flight home early. She's already told the driver your address. I called the number back immediately. It rang twice before Owen picked up, his voice low like he was hiding in a stairwell somewhere. "It's me," he said. "I used the hotel business center. I didn't want to risk her seeing it on my phone." "She's furious, Corinne. She booked an earlier flight the second she got off with her mother. She's landing in about 3 hours. I'm staying to deal with the room situation, but I wanted you to know before she got there." I thanked him and hung up, and then I called my grandfather, who was still in town, staying at a hotel near the airport before his flight back to Scottsdale the next morning. I told him everything: the checks, the card, the 3 hours I had left before my sister arrived at my door expecting an apology. I had no intention of giving her. "I'll come now," Elias said, no hesitation at all in his voice. "Order yourself something for dinner. I'll be there within the hour." He arrived with a bag from a barbecue place near the highway and sat at my kitchen table while the kids finished their food, and I put together the pieces of what I now understood about the missing checks, cross-referencing dates in a spreadsheet I'd built on my laptop out of pure professional habit, the same instinct that made me color code discrepancies in client audits so nothing could hide inside a rounding error. Renata arrived at 9:40 that night, roughly 20 minutes after I'd finally gotten Bo down for the night in the guest room I kept made up for exactly this kind of emergency. She didn't knock. She used her old key, the one I'd honestly forgotten she still had, and let herself into my apartment with the particular fury of someone who has spent an entire flight rehearsing a speech. "You have no idea what you've done," she said, before she'd even fully closed the door behind her. Her voice was pitched to carry, the way it always was when she wanted an audience to witness her outrage, rather than actually resolve anything. "Do you know what that room cost us? Do you understand what you did to my marriage over a stupid ceremony?" "Sit down, Renata," I said. My own voice came out steadier than I expected it to. "We need to talk about the checks." She stopped mid-sentence. I watched something flicker across her face, fast, gone almost before I registered it. But I've spent 6 years learning to read the exact moment a person realizes they've been caught in something they thought was buried. "What checks?" she said. Too flat, too fast. My grandfather set down his coffee cup with a small, deliberate click against the table. "The ones I mailed to your mother's old address in 2022, Renata. 4 of them. $500 each for Corinne's tuition. They never arrived." "I don't know what you're talking about. Owen mentioned it to me this afternoon," I said. "Your mother-in-law brought it up to him months ago. Something about you holding onto checks so Mom wouldn't feel bad that Grandpa was only helping me." Renata's face went through several versions of itself in a rapid succession: indignation, then something closer to panic, then a kind of cold recalibration I recognized because I'd watched her do it my entire life, the moment she decided which story was going to serve her best and committed to it fully. "I was going to give them to you," she said. "I was holding on to them because Mom was struggling that year and I didn't want her to see Dad playing favorites again, showering you with money while the rest of us got nothing. I was protecting the family, Corinne. I was always protecting this family, and this is the thanks I get." "You deposited them," I said quietly, "into an account that wasn't mine. That's not protecting anyone. That's theft, Renata. From your own father, meant for your own sister's education." "Don't you dare use that word with me," she said, and her voice cracked. But I couldn't tell anymore whether it was genuine or performed, because I'd stopped being able to trust the difference somewhere around the 6th voicemail the day before. "I have sacrificed my entire life for this family. I raised you. I basically raised you when Dad left and Mom was working doubles, and this is what I get. Accusations, a canceled hotel room, you humiliating me in front of everyone. You did raise me," I said, "and I have thanked you for that my whole life, in every way I knew how. I skipped my GRE for you. I held your daughter in a bathroom stall while my own name got called to an empty aisle. I said yes to babysitting 3 kids for 4 days so you could go on vacation, even after you told me my degree was a piece of paper. I have been saying yes to you for 29 years, Renata, and somewhere in there you decided that meant you were allowed to steal from me too." The front door opened before she could answer. Owen stood in the doorway, still in the clothes he'd flown home in, having caught a red-eye the moment the room situation in Maui was sorted, his face pale and exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with jet lag. "I need you to say that again," he told Renata, his voice very quiet. "The part about the checks. Say it again, so I can hear it clearly this time." Renata turned to him, and for the first time all night, something in her posture actually broke, the performance faltering because the audience had shifted into someone she couldn't out-argue with volume alone. "Owen, this is between me and my sister. You told me she volunteered," he said. "You told me babysitting was her idea, that she wanted the practice. You've been telling me for 8 years that your family adores having you as the glue holding everyone together, and I believed you, because why wouldn't I? And now I'm standing in Corinne's kitchen finding out you stole money meant for her education and lied to your own father's face about it 30 seconds ago. It's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple," he said. "I watched you cry on a beach because a hotel room got canceled. I flew home early because I thought my wife had been genuinely wronged, and instead I find out you've spent this entire marriage managing what I get to know about your own sister, curating it, deciding what version of you I was allowed to see." He looked at Elias, then at me, something settling in his expression that looked almost like grief. "I'm sorry. I should have asked more questions a long time ago." Renata's face crumpled, and for a moment I almost reached for her out of old habit, the 11-year-old who braided my hair still living somewhere under underneath 30 years of accumulated resentment, but I made myself stay still. I need you to hear one thing clearly, I told her, and I made sure my voice didn't shake. I am done being the emergency you call when your life needs managing, and the embarrassment you hide when it's inconvenient. I love those kids upstairs more than almost anything in this world, and I will always be there for them. But I am not available to you anymore, Renata. Not like this. Not ever again. You'll regret this, she said, one hand still on the doorframe. When you're older, when you don't have anyone left who remembers what it was like when we were kids, you'll regret pushing away the one person who actually raised you. Maybe I will, I said, but I'd rather regret this than spend another decade explaining away the things you do to people who love you. At least this way, whatever I regret, it'll be something I chose on purpose. She didn't have an answer for that. I'm not sure she'd ever had to sit with a version of me that didn't flinch first. She looked at me for a long moment, mascara streaked, mouth open like she was building toward another argument, and then, finding none of her usual footing anywhere in the room, she turned and walked out, leaving the door open behind her into the cold hallway air. Owen stayed that night. He slept on my couch, in the same clothes he'd flown home in, because he didn't have anywhere else to put himself at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday, and because the kids needed at least one parent under a stable roof while the other one drove somewhere unknown in the dark, still furious, still unwilling to sit still long enough to be told the truth twice. The days that followed moved faster than I expected, the way things do once a structure that's been quietly rotting finally gives way all at once, instead of piece by piece. My Aunt Rosalind called me 3 days later, and I almost didn't pick up, bracing myself for another round of accusations about theft and ingratitude. Instead, her voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it, apologetic in a way that felt almost unfamiliar coming from her. Your grandfather told me about the checks, she said. I didn't know, Corinne. I want you to understand that. I've spent 30 years believing Renata was the one holding this family together, and I think I built a version of her in my head that let me ignore anything that didn't fit. She paused. I'm sorry I called you a thief before I knew what actually happened. I told her I appreciated that, and I meant it, even though something in me stayed guarded, unwilling to fully hand back the trust she'd spent so many years spending down. My mother took longer. She called me twice that week, and I let both calls go to voicemail, not out of spite, but because I genuinely didn't know yet what I wanted to say to her. When we finally spoke, on a Sunday afternoon while I sat on my balcony with a cup of coffee going cold beside me, she cried before I did, apologizing for a lifetime of small deferrals to Renata that had brick by brick built the exact situation I'd found myself standing in at my own graduation. I always told myself she needed more from me because your father leaving hit her harder, my mother said. She was older, she remembered more. I thought giving her more space meant she'd grow into someone generous with it eventually. A long pause. I don't think I ever stopped to ask what it cost you. I didn't have an answer for her that felt complete, so I just told her I loved her and that I needed some time, and she said okay, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, she actually gave it to me instead of asking for reassurance in return. Renata did not go quietly. That would have required a version of her I don't think exists. 9 days after the confrontation in my kitchen, a woman from her bank's fraud department called me at work, following up on a dispute Renata had filed claiming the hotel cancellation was unauthorized use of a card that wasn't mine to control. I forwarded the representative the 9:47 p.m. text. The one that read, this card is for genuine emergencies involving Milo, Ren, or Bo only. Timestamped, unedited, straight from my own phone's backup. The representative thanked me for my cooperation and closed the case within the week, noting there was clear documented authorization for use of the card at the cardholder's own discretion regarding the children's welfare. I never heard about it again. 3 weeks after that, Renata showed up at Hallbrook and Wexler unannounced, asking the front desk for me by name, her voice loud enough that I heard it from my cubicle before anyone came to get me. I met her in the lobby rather than let her come further into the office, because some professional instinct told me this needed witnesses who weren't emotionally invested in either of us. You've turned my own husband against me, she said, not bothering to lower her voice, ignoring the receptionist who was very obviously listening. You've turned my whole family against me. Are you happy now? Is this what you wanted? I wanted to walk across the stage for 6 years of night classes, I said. That's genuinely all I wanted, Renata. Everything after that was you. Building security asked her to leave 12 minutes later, after she'd raised her voice enough times that a coworker called down to the front desk out of concern. She didn't come back. Her next move was smaller, almost pathetic in retrospect. She emailed the dean's office at Kestrel Ridge, claiming I had inappropriately used a university ceremony to stage what she called a public spectacle without parental consent for the children involved. The Office of Student Affairs reached out to me once, briefly, more out of procedural obligation than actual concern, and closed the inquiry within a day once I explained I was the children's legal guardian for the weekend, with their mother's own written authorization on file, the same authorization she'd texted me herself 2 weeks earlier. Somewhere in the middle of all of it, I finally did what I should have done the first week, and paid for an hour with a family law attorney named Diane Castellano, mostly to understand whether any of Renata's accusations, the fraud dispute, the dean's complaint, the general chaos, actually exposed me to real liability. Diane read through the texts I'd saved, the timestamps, the written authorization, and told me plainly that I had built, without realizing realizing it, close to an airtight paper trail, the kind she said she wished half her actual clients arrived with. "Whatever field you're in," she said, sliding the folder back across her desk, "keep doing it exactly like this." I laughed for the first time in almost 2 weeks. Owen filed for separation 6 weeks after the confrontation, and for divorce not long after that. He asked for primary custody, citing, among other things, a documented pattern of manipulation and financial dishonesty that a family court would eventually take seriously enough to grant him the bulk of the custody arrangement he asked for. The mediation sessions ran through most of that autumn, and Owen told me afterward that Renata's own attorney had quietly encouraged her twice to settle rather than let a judge review the full text history Owen's side had compiled, most of it forwarded originally from me. She settled. Renata got weekends and alternating holidays, along with a request, granted, that any exchange of the children happen at a neutral location, rather than either parent's home. I know all of this because Owen still tells me these things, because somewhere in the wreckage of his marriage, he and I had become something like allies, bound together by the particular intimacy of having survived the same person's version of events for years without realizing it. My grandfather never asked Renata to repay the $2,000 directly. Instead, quietly, without any dramatic announcement, he adjusted his will that summer, a fact I only learned secondhand from my mother, who mentioned it almost in passing, the way you mention weather that's already happened. He didn't disinherit Renata entirely. He simply stopped pretending the ledger between them was even, which felt, in its own understated way, like the harshest thing he could have done to a daughter's daughter who had built her entire identity around being the responsible one. He called me himself the day he made the appointment with his lawyer, not to ask permission, he said, but because he thought I deserved to hear it from him directly, rather than through my mother's version of events. "I'm not doing this to punish her," he told me, his voice steady in the particular way that only comes from having outlived several harder conversations than this one. "I'm doing it because I finally understand what actually happened to those checks, and a man my age doesn't have the years left to keep pretending he doesn't know things." I thanked him and told him he didn't owe me an explanation, and he laughed, a short, dry sound down the phone line. "No," he agreed, "but you've spent your whole life being the one who has to explain herself to everyone else. Figured it was somebody else's turn." I sat with that for a long time after we hung up, phone still warm against my palm, the apartment quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and Bo's cartoons playing faintly from the next room where Owen had left him for the afternoon. It was, I think, the single kindest thing anyone said to me that entire year, and it came, fittingly enough, from the one person who had actually shown up when it counted, both at my graduation and afterward, without ever once needing to be asked twice. My cousin Marlon drove up from Cincinnati one Saturday that June, unannounced, with his fiancée and a six-pack of the beer I liked in college, and we sat on my balcony for 3 hours while he told me the rest of what had happened at his engagement party. Details he hadn't included in that first private message, how Renata had actually convinced his own mother-in-law to delay the toast, how it had taken him nearly 2 years to even name what she'd done as manipulation rather than simple bad timing. "I kept telling myself it wasn't a big deal," he said, turning the bottle in his hands. "Watching you finally say it out loud made me realize I'd been doing the same math you were doing, just quietly, for years, by myself." Marlon and his fiancée got married that October. I sat in the second row, no children to hold, no ceremony to miss, and cried through the entire thing anyway. Thanksgiving that year was smaller than it had ever been, and stranger. My mother hosted, the way she always did, but the seating chart told the real story of where everyone had landed. Rosalind came, quieter than usual, bringing a pie and an offer to help with dishes she'd never once made in 30 years of holidays. Foster brought his daughter, the one from the recital, and made a point of sitting beside me. Marlon called in on video from Cincinnati because the drive was too far for a single evening, propping his phone against a candle so he could still be part of the table. Owen brought the kids for the first half of the day, on schedule, on time, the custody agreement already working exactly the way it was designed to. Renata wasn't there. Nobody said her name until dessert, when my mother, setting down a coffee pot with a hand that wasn't quite steady, said quietly that she'd talked to her that morning, that Renata was spending the holiday with Owen's cousin 2 towns over because she hadn't been able to bring herself to ask if she was still welcome at ours. Nobody answered that. Nobody needed to. The silence that followed wasn't cruel. It was just honest. The kind of honest a family can only afford once it's stopped protecting the wrong person from consequences. There is a version of this story that ends there, clean and satisfying. Sister exposed, husband awakened, grandfather vindicated, credit card canceled in poetic justice. But that's not entirely honest, and I promised myself I'd tell this one honestly. I still think about Renata at 11 years old, braiding my hair before the school bus came, walking me the 4 blocks to Jefferson Elementary with a hand wrapped tight around mine because our mother was already at work, and someone had to make sure I got there safely. I think about her at 14, teaching me to ride a bike in the church parking lot near our old apartment, running alongside me for an entire block before letting go, laughing when I finally stopped wobbling. I don't think that girl was lying. I think she genuinely loved me, in whatever language she'd learned love in, a language built entirely out of sacrifice and control in equal measure, because nobody had ever taught her they could exist separately. There were nights that summer, after everything had settled into its new and permanent shape, when I sat alone alone on my balcony and cried. Not for the vindication, which I'd already had plenty of, but for the sister I used to have before responsibility calcified into entitlement somewhere along the way. I mourned her the way you mourn someone who is still alive, still texting occasionally, still technically reachable by phone, but who no longer exists in any form I recognize as safe to love the way I used to. That grief didn't cancel out what she'd done. It just sat alongside it, the way two true things can occupy the same chest without needing to resolve into one simple feeling. It's been a little over a year now since that graduation. I finished my last 2 classes that August, which meant the actual conferral of my degree happened quietly, on paper. Weeks after the ceremony, everyone actually remembers. I got a promotion to senior forensic accountant that following spring, largely on the strength of a fraud case I helped unwind for a regional credit union, a case that involved exactly the kind of small, repeated discrepancies I'd learned to recognize somewhere much closer to home first. I see Milo, Ren, and Bo most weekends now. Owen makes a point of it, dropping them off Friday evenings on his custody weeks, picking them up Sunday nights with takeout for both of us because he says, only half joking, that raising 3 kids as a newly single father requires strategic alliances. Ren still tells everyone her aunt is a doctor. I've stopped correcting her. Some fictions are harmless enough to let live. My grandfather visits twice a year now instead of once, staying in the guest room that used to be Bo's emergency crib setup and is now just a guest room, permanently made up, because apparently that's what happens to a spare bedroom once your family stops treating your home as a place to drop children off and starts treating it as a place worth visiting on its own merits. I talked to Renata exactly once in the past year, at our mother's request, a stilted 20-minute conversation in a coffee shop that neither of us finished our drinks during. She didn't apologize, not really, not in the way that would have actually meant something. She said she was working on herself, in the flattened language of someone repeating a phrase from a self-help book, rather than living it. I told her I hoped that was true, and I meant it. And then I paid for both our coffees and left, because some habits of care outlast the relationships that built them, and I've decided that's allowed. I can hope good things for her from a safe distance. That's not the same as letting her back into the parts of my life she used to manage without asking. I have my diploma framed now, finally, the actual physical piece of paper Renata once told me wasn't worth clapping for. It hangs in my hallway next to a photograph from the ceremony itself. Milo mid-scream in his collared shirt, Ren holding her sign at a crooked angle, Bo's candy diploma still clutched in one fist. I look at it most mornings on my way out the door. Here's the thing I've come to understand. The thing I think this whole story was always actually about, underneath the vacation and the credit card and the checks that never arrived. It was never really about hats and gowns. It was never about wanting an audience, the way Renata accused me of that morning on the phone, 2 weeks before everything changed. It was about wanting, just once, for something I had worked 6 years to earn not to be treated as negotiable the moment someone else's convenience required it. I think about my grandfather standing up out of his seat that day, cane and all, applauding until his hands must have ached. I think about what it means that the person who traveled the farthest to be there was the one who almost got talked out of coming and came anyway. I think about the difference between being loved by people who show up and being managed by people who decide, on your behalf, what you deserve to have witnessed. I don't feel triumphant anymore, if I ever really did. What I feel is quieter than that, steadier. I still miss the sister who braided my hair before school, the one who ran alongside my bicycle in a church parking lot until I stopped wobbling. She isn't gone, not exactly. She's just further away than she used to be, living somewhere on the other side of a boundary I built out of necessity, rather than cruelty. And some days that distance still aches in a way vindication never quite reaches. But I walked across that stage. 3 kids screamed my name louder than the rest of the auditorium combined, and an old man in a bolo tie stood up on a bad hip to clap for me anyway. And somewhere in Maui, a hotel room sat empty for one night because I finally decided my own name, called out loud in a room full of people who came to hear it, mattered as much as anyone else's. People ask me sometimes, the few who know the full version rather than the group chat highlights, whether I'd do anything differently if I could go back to that first phone call. I've thought about it honestly, more than once, turning it over the way I turn over a set of books that don't balance the first time through. I wouldn't skip the ceremony. I wouldn't handle the credit card any differently either, whatever that says about me. But I think, if I could change one thing, I'd go back further than that phone call. I'd go back to being 19, or 22, or 25, and I'd practice saying no to something small, long before the stakes ever got large enough to require an entire graduation and a canceled hotel room to teach me how. That's the part of this story I'd tell a younger version of myself if I had the chance. Not that families can be cruel, because most of us learn that eventually, one way or another. But that the smallest yeses, the ones that feel harmless in the moment, the 4 extra days, the missed test, the bathroom stall, are the ones that teach the people around you exactly how much of yourself they're allowed to take before you'll finally say stop. I said yes for 29 years. It took 1 graduation, 3 kids in their best clothes, and a canceled hotel room in Maui to finally teach my whole family, myself included, what stop actually sounded like coming out of my mouth. It was never about the hats and gowns. It was about being allowed, just once, to have a moment that belonged entirely to me. I got that moment. I'd do it again exactly the same way, even knowing everything it would eventually cost.